the devil doesn't like it when we keep our mind on him, because it gives him no room to play with us. If we can get the ushers to come, we'll go ahead and take up the offering. We do serve a great God, don't we? You may be seated. Before I start tonight, I'd just like to take a moment and thank Pastor Kelly and Pastor Gordon for allowing me to be able to speak to y'all tonight. It's really something to have great leadership that takes time, and they invest it in others. And I'm thankful for that. Have you ever heard somebody talk about two people that grew up in the same house? They had the same parents. They went to the same church. They did the same things, but they turned out totally different. You know, one of them might have been a sweet angel. The other one might have been a devil. You know, one of them might have stayed in church. One of them might have left church. But they had the same teaching. They had the same opportunity, but it come down to choice. They chose to do what they did. You know, we as humans, we always like to blame others for what happened to us or for what we did. It's always somebody else's fault. And, you know, sometimes when somebody leaves the church, we want to blame the pastor, or we want to blame the Sunday school teacher or the youth leader that they didn't do enough, or we want to blame the church in general. Well, there's only so much a pastor can do. A pastor can't be with somebody 24/7. A Sunday school teacher can't be with somebody 24/7. Same thing for a youth leader. Same thing with just for a member of the church. It comes down to we make the choice of what we're going to do. And, you know, sometimes when you go through a trial, it's hard. And when you're going through a trial, sometimes God speaks to you. And when God speaks to you, sometimes you don't understand it. This message, God laid on my heart back last April. And I was driving down the road. I was on my way to work. And God started talking to me because I was going through some things, facing some things. And God kept asking me the same question over and over and over. And the question was, he said, Vern, he said, are you going to be a Judas or are you going to be a Peter? And it just kept coming to my head, And I said, God, I said, what are you talking about? I started arguing with him, started getting mad, really. I'm like, God, I don't understand what you're trying to tell me. What are you telling me? So I got the guys to work, and I went home and just started studying. And the first thing I did is I looked up the name Judas, what Judas meant. You know, when we hear the name Judas, we think of a traitor or betrayal. But in Hebrew, it actually means praise or the praised one. So started doing some more studying about Judas, you know, what kind of man he was, where he was from. And one of the interesting facts that I found was, out of the 12 disciples, he was the only one that wasn't from Galilee. The other 11 was from Galilee. He was from Judea, or Judah. And that Iscariot, his last name, was representing the town that he was from. And got to studying more about the name Judas. And in the Bible, it's found 38 times. But it's referenced in 6 different people. I always thought there was only one Judas in the Bible. But there was actually 6 different Judases in the Bible. So the more that I got to studying, you know, the one thing we know him for is that he betrayed Jesus. Anytime you hear the name Judas, he betrayed Jesus. He turned Jesus in for 30 pieces of silver. But I got to studying, and you know, Judas, he carried the bag of money. The rest of the disciples, if you read what they thought about him, they didn't think highly of him. They called him a thief. They called him all kind of bad names. But I got to thinking, you know, Judas, he was handpicked. He was chosen by God as one of the original 12. So, you know, God picked him for a reason. And, you know, Judas walked with God for 3.5 years. He ate with him. He talked with him, was able to shake his hand. He seen God perform all the miracles. You know, from the healings to the blinded eyes open to you name it, Judas seen it. And he probably performed some of it because God empowered him to do the same thing. So, you know, Judas wasn't always bad. But there had to be something that happened that turned Judas's heart. There had to be something that happened. And one of the people I was reading had a little commentary about Judas, said that he might have been a follower of John the Baptist from some of the studying that they did, and that when John the Baptist got killed, that he was upset with Jesus because Jesus didn't save him. And, I don't know if I believe that or not, but it was just one of the things that was said. But with the other disciples, with them calling him a thief, Judas seemed like an outsider because he wasn't from Galilee. He wasn't one of the home folk. Maybe he didn't fit in with the rest of them. Maybe they didn't like the same things. Maybe he wasn't a fisherman. Maybe he just liked money. And anytime there's money involved, people get jealous. There's always the boss makes too much money, or there's a mishandling of the money. There's always something to do with the money. But like I said, there had to be some stuff that happened. People said something, whatever. But in Luke chapter 22, verse 6, it said, "And he promised and sought out opportunity to betray him unto them in the absence of the multitude." And that really stuck with me, that as long as Judas was with the other 11, or as long as Judas was with the multitude, or we can say the church, he didn't sin. Because there's safety in the church, there's comfort in the church, most of the time there's unity in the church. But that Judas, he had to leave them, because when we're around our brothers and sisters in Christ, it's hard to sin. Because we look at sin as shame. We look at it as guilt. We don't want people to think badly of us. So there's safety in the church. So he left the church to go sin. And that's probably when he was dipping in the bag of money, taking money out. That's when he went to betray Jesus. So, at the Last Supper, when he went to betray Jesus, Jesus warned him. He told him, one of y'all is going to betray me. And, he told all 12 of them who it was going to be. He said, who dips the bread with me, he drinks with me. He told them all. And, when he was telling them that, the first thing that everybody was worried about, they said, is it me? Is it me, Lord, that's going to betray you? They should have been prayed up enough that they didn't have to worry about if it was going to be them. And if they was prayed up enough, and if they had their own heart right with God, maybe they could have helped Judas. But God said, what you're going to do, leave now, go do it quickly. They didn't recognize he was gone. If God told me, and there was 12 of us in the room, one of y'all was going to betray me, and I knew it wasn't me, I would be looking out like, hey, what's up with the rest of y'all? But, they didn't do that. They was worried about their self. But when they was asking God, is it I, Lord? All of them called him Lord or God, but Judas didn't. Judas called him Rabbi. He said, is it I, Rabbi? Which, Rabbi means teacher. So Judas, to me, I think Judas didn't have the true understanding of who God was. Because he looked at him as a teacher. He didn't look at him as the Savior, the Messiah. When God asked him, who did the Son of Man say that I am? They said all kind of different stuff. Then Peter stood up and told him who he was. But, like I said, Judas walked with Jesus. He seen all the miracles. He did all that. We as people, and in the standard at the time, he was considered a man of God. With everything that he was doing, he was a man of God. Up until that point, he didn't betray Jesus. He might have dipped in the bag here or there, but he was doing everything God asked him to do. So from the outside, he looked like a man of God. And, we as people sometimes forget that the man of God in our life is not God. That the man of God is human. That the man of God does fail. They do make mistakes. They might get angry. They might say something out of order. They're not God. And when they do, we got to forgive them. And we got to move on past it. Matthew 26, verse 8 talks about how when the oil was poured upon Jesus, how Judas got mad and said it's a waste of money, that money could have been given to the poor. And, it was something that bitterness set in. And when bitterness sets in and anger and all that, you got to get rid of it. If not, it builds up and it causes you to do something that you regret the rest of your life. Matthew 26, verses 14 through 15, it says, Judas makes a deal with the high priest to give up God for 30 pieces of silver. Judas was a man that was carrying around all kind of money. So money wasn't the object to him. Because if Jesus was still alive, he could still dip in the bag. So 30 pieces of silver wasn't nothing. He just didn't have the true meaning of who Jesus was, the true revelation of who Jesus was. The question I got for you is, Judas gave up Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. What are you willing to give up God for? Are you willing to give up God for a job? For a pay raise? For some guy or girl that you've seen? For a better car, a better house? What are you willing to give up for God? So, now I'm going to talk about Peter just for a couple of minutes. The name Simon got changed to Peter, and the meaning of Peter's name is stone. Is the Hebrew meaning of the name Peter is stone. And y'all kind of find it funny that God changed his name to Peter because he said, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. But, Peter had the same opportunities as Judas. He walked with Jesus. He touched Jesus. He heard Jesus teach and preach. He ate with him. He lived with him. He heard the voice of God. He was there when the feeding of both the 5,000 and the 4,000. Peter seen devils casted out. He seen the blinded eyes open, the lame walk. He was also used by God to perform all kind of miracles. Peter had a clearer understanding of who Jesus was. Peter said he was a living God. And studying where the 12 disciples, every time they're listed in the Bible, it starts out with Peter, James, and John. Then in between that, there might be a name or two that gets switched, but at the end of it is always Judas. And it says the one that betrayed God. Just because he was listed at the bottom doesn't mean he was no different than anybody else, because somebody had to be the 12th disciple. Somebody always had to be listed last. Sometimes we get offended when a name's put in front of us or somebody's put in front of us. It shouldn't be that way. If we're serving God, we're serving God. Not for the recognition, not that he did great or he taught great or he preached great or he's preaching first. It's that we're serving God. Jesus had to correct both Peter and Judas. And when God corrected them, he didn't pull them to the side and say, hey, you were out of line. You spoke up for me, or you dipped in the money bag, or you did this or you did that. It wasn't the one-on-one. When they messed up, God corrected them right there on the spot. He called Peter. After he said, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. 6 verses later, he told Peter, he said, get behind me, Satan. If Pastor Kelly or Pastor Gordon was up here and I was sitting down there and they called me Satan, there's about a 99.9% chance if I don't come up here that I'm walking out the door. But God was that way. He was stern with them. And he might have did it to hurt their feelings a little bit, but he was doing it to get a point across. But, both of them was called Satan. At the Last Supper, he called Judas Satan. So, both of them were hurt by Jesus by how he corrected them. But in the Bible, there's over 13 times that Peter sinned. From if it was speaking up for Jesus, if it was denying God, if it was, there's all kind of stuff that Peter did that were sins. But, one sin's no bigger than the other. If it's stealing, if it's killing, if it's denying Christ, a sin is a sin. You know, when Judas turned Jesus in, it set in motion events that will make all the disciples sin. You know, us today, we think about ourselves a lot. It's what benefits me, what brings me pleasure, what can I do? And a lot of times we don't worry about everybody else. But us as Christians, when we sin, it don't only affect me, it affects my family, it affects my friends, it affects my church. And when Judas sinned and turned in Jesus, like I said, he set in the motion the events that made Peter and the rest of the disciples sin. Even though Peter had to make the decision to do it, that opportunity wouldn't be there. If Judas didn't turn Jesus in, there's a good chance Peter wouldn't have denied him. The other disciples wouldn't have fled in the garden when Jesus was arrested. It said they all fled and ran away from him. So we got to be careful what we do because it affects everybody else around us. Jesus knew Peter was going to fail. In Luke 22, verses 31 through 32, and it says, "And the Lord said, Simon, Simon, Satan has desired to have you, that he may shift you as wheat. But I have prayed for thee, that thy faith will fail not, and when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren." You know, sometimes we're guilty of kicking somebody when they're down. When somebody falls, when somebody falls and sins, sometimes we talk about them, sometimes we kick them while they're down. And I've been guilty of that myself. But as the church family, we need to be there for them. We need to be there to lift them up, be there to help them through it. Because sometimes when a person is going through a battle, it's not because they sinned. It's not because God's punishing them. It's so that when they make it to the other side, that they will be able to strengthen us. Because sometimes you can't help somebody and you can't be there for them because you ain't been where they've been. You know, there's only so much you can learn from a book. There's only so much you can see on TV. But until you've been through it personally, sometimes you just can't help that person. And sometimes, you know, God lets us go through that stuff. And it's when we come through the other side that the person going through the battle can help somebody else. You know, Luke chapter 22, verse 36, and it says, well, Jesus set Peter up for failure. I know that doesn't sound right. Why would God set somebody up to fail? But in verse 36, Jesus tells his disciples to go buy a sword. If they don't have one, it says, sell your garment and buy one. And this is when they're going to the garden right before Jesus gets led away. And I was reading that and I'm like, why do they need to buy a sword? You know what? It said, if you don't have one, take your garment, sell it, and buy a sword. And I got to reading. Well, that's when Peter grabs the sword and cuts the ear off the guard that grabbed hold of Jesus. Jesus used that. He knew Peter was going to act without thinking. Peter always spoke up when he shouldn't. He always said stuff. He always did stuff without thinking it through. Sometimes that's a bad thing, but sometimes it's a good thing. Sometimes we need to speak and not worry about what everybody else thinks. You know, a lot of times when we go to witness to somebody, we're like, if I mention God, they might look down upon me, or I might not get the job, or I might not get the promotion, or I could offend somebody. Well, Peter wasn't that way. It come to mind, he said it. Suffer the consequences later. But Peter took the sword, he cut the ear off the servant, and God reached down and put it back on him. That's one of the last things God did before he was crucified. He was showing his disciples once again who he truly was, that he was God. I think God trusted Peter, with the keys to the kingdom, like I said, because he didn't care what other people thought. He would speak up, and when the day came, the day of Pentecost, when he needed to speak up, Peter stood up and told them what they needed to hear. So there's a lot about Peter and Judas. But the question I got for you tonight is, are you going to be a Judas and let something that you did when you was away from the safety of the church, when you was away from the multitude, or are you going to let that sin or that action cause you your walk with God? Because Judas had the same opportunity as Peter. Judas could have took, and it said Judas, he felt remorse for what he did. It said, he took the money back, threw the money back, said he didn't want it. He showed remorse. But like I said earlier, he didn't have a true understanding of who God was. Because if he did, he would have repented. 3.5 years of teaching, that should have been drilled into him. If he believed that who Jesus really was, he would have asked him for forgiveness. And he didn't do it, so he went out and he hung himself and killed himself because he couldn't live with what he did. There's a lot of people today that show remorse for what they did. But instead of coming to God and asking God for forgiveness, they want to take and they want to run as far away from the church and as far away from God as possible. And that's the worst thing that they can do. Because nobody's perfect. The Bible says we've all sinned and come short of the glory of God. And if we have a true understanding of who God is, we know that God will forgive us if we want to be forgiven. And that's the big thing. You got to want it. If you don't ask him for it, he's never going to do it. Then, Peter, God told Peter that he was going to deny him, that he knew he was going to fail. And it said, when the other disciples, when they fled, it said Peter followed Jesus from afar off. So, Peter wanted to see what was going on. Then while God was on the cross, he looked over at Peter, and when their eyes met, Peter felt remorse. He knew that God knew that he sinned. And what did Peter do? Peter asked God for forgiveness, and God restored him. Sometimes when you're being used in the church and stuff happens, you feel like God can't never use you again because you messed up one time, that God can never use you. And that's a lie that Satan puts in our mind. If you give him just that little bit of room in your mind, he's going to own your mind. He's going to tell you, no, you messed up, or this happened, or you did this. I might have, but my God forgave me. And when God forgives you, he can restore you. And when God restores you, he can use you. But you got to want it, and you got to be willing to let him do it, because God won't do anything for us that we don't want him to do. So, both Peter and Judas, they sinned. What sin was worse? Denying Christ or betraying him? What sin was worse? It's the same. They sinned. It doesn't matter what the sin was, they sinned. And they both had the same opportunity. Like I said, they both followed him for 3.5 years. They both seen the same things. It wasn't that one of them was favored over the other. It was that one of them had a revelation of who he was, had a true understanding, and knew that he could ask for forgiveness and God would forgive him. So like I said earlier, when you're faced with the choice, are you going to be a Judas and let that one bad decision determine where you're going to spend eternity? Are you going to let it run you away from the church? Or are you going to let it run you away from the people that really care about you and put you on an island by yourself? Because when we leave the safety of the multitude, it's like a lion when he's going after his prey. He doesn't run right into the middle of the pack, in the middle of the herd, and just grab a hold of something. He sits back on the edge and he watches. And he watches and he watches and he watches until that one, till he finds a weak one. And once that weak one falls away from the herd, then he attacks. The devil's the same way. The Bible says he's like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. So, us, even if you've been in church 40 years, 50 years, If you get away from the church, if you quit coming, you miss a Sunday, then you miss a Wednesday, then you miss 2 Sundays in a row. I don't care how strong you think you are, you will eventually fall. But if you got the people around you that love you, that care about you, they will lift you back up and you can make it. Don't put yourself out there as that one away from the pack where you're vulnerable, where something could happen. Stay close to the church. Stay close to God. If you stay close to God, you'll stay close to the church. But like I said, if you don't want to be a Judas, you can be a Peter. You can tell God, you can ask God for the forgiveness. Say, God, hey, I messed up. Will you forgive me? And God can go on to use you to do great things. But it's just we gotta want it. We gotta want it. So in closing, this is going to be kind of short, but just in closing again, just ask yourself the question: are you going to be a Judas, or are you going to be a Peter? When God was dealing with me on that, when He kept asking me that question, like I said, I was almost fighting mad. I was like, God, you know what? Nobody wants to be a Judas. Nobody wants that name. When you're looking for baby names, you don't think about the name Judas. It's like, nah, we'll check that one off the list real quick. No, nobody wants to be known as a Judas. But if we have a church full of Peters, just imagine what can happen. If you're not afraid to witness, if you're not afraid to talk to the kids at school, the P7 club, that's a big step. When I was in high school, I was the only Pentecostal kid at my school, as far as I know. It was hard to talk to people. You're scared because you're a little different. But being different's good. You could be the Peter that changes Tullahoma High School. It's each one of y'all have a job where you can witness to somebody. But if you never witness to them, if you never invite them to church, guess what? They ain't never coming. There's a small chance they might just pop up. But unless we invite them, unless we witness, unless we do our part, most likely they're not going to come here. So if we have a room full of Peters, we can fill this church up. There could be great things that happen. There could be miracles, signs, and wonders. Those are for us. They wasn't just for the Bible. That's for us. But we got to have that attitude of Peter that no matter what, we're not going to quit. We're going to keep on fighting. We're going to keep on moving. We're going to keep moving forward. Because if you stay where you're at, you're in trouble. Because sooner or later, if you stay where you're at, you're going to die. You got to keep moving forward. So like I said, in closing, just ask yourself tonight, if y'all want to play a little music, we can just have a little prayer, then at the end of it, you can be dismissed. But just ask yourself tonight when you pray, are you a Judas or are you a Peter?
So King